Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the second day of this year's Behavioral Science Week. So in this session, we will talk about behavioral science and sustainability. And during this hour, we will be presenting cases related to climate change and emotions, consumer behavior, how to stop open burning, and how behavioral science can support and inform scientific assessments. Just to let you know that this is the first session of this day. Make sure you register for all the sessions that are part of your interests. And finally, in this session, we have 4 panelists. After the panelists speak, we will leave some time for Q&A. So please, as you listen to the presentations, use the Q&A feature to leave your question, and we will come back to them at the end. Also, please include to whom the question is directed so we know when we pick them up. And here are the panelists for today. We have Tobias Brosch, Associate Professor at the University of Geneva, who will be talking about climate change and emotions. Harpreet Kaur, Business and Human Rights Specialist from UNDP Asia Pacific. Rachel Kos, Associate Program Officer from UNEP, and me, who is talking to you, Aileen Tomio, from the Behavioral Scientist, Mind, Behavior and Development Unit at the World Bank. Without further ado, I'm going to present Tobias Brosch, who will be talking about emotions and climate action. Please, Tobias, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen okay. Let me know if that's not the case. So as Eileen said, I will talk about the role of emotions in the context of climate change, and especially to what extent there might be a potential to use emotions to motivate climate action worldwide. So climate change is obviously an existential threat to the well-being and survival of mankind. And as such, it is prone to elicit a number of different emotions. So as we see in surveys now that are being done all around the world, many people feel worried or sad, or angry, guilty, sometimes also hopeful or proud in the context of climate change. And what is very interesting is that these emotions, they seem to have a motivational function. So we find that the people who feel a lot of emotion toward climate change, they are also more willing to engage in climate change mitigation and adaptation action, and are also more willing to support climate policy. So the important question here, of course, is can we, by activating people's emotions, make it more likely that they engage in relevant climate action? Are there ways to use this force of emotion? And in order to answer this question, we did take a look at all the existing evaluations of climate communication strategies, and we compared the impact of the different communication approaches. So based on findings from, based on more than 300,000 people, we find that effective communications consistently outperform most other approaches in increasing climate relevant behavior and climate policy support. So these effective emotion-based strategies, they might try to increase perceptions of the threat posed by climate change by making it more easily to understand, more salient. They might activate loss aversion mechanisms by pointing out all the things that we have to lose from climate change, or they may aim to elicit specific emotions such as fear or hope or anger and leverage the motivational effects that come with those. So this seems to point out that emotions might be a very potent driver of climate action that we could use more in our communication strategies. While emotions can be a strong driver of climate action, they can also act as barriers, because sometimes having too much of an emotion is also not a good thing. And so one very concrete example for that is range anxiety, which is an emotion that can actually hinder the electrification of mobility. Why is this important? So we know that a large percentage of global CO2 emissions are due to road traffic, and that because of that, the electrification of mobility has been identified as an important policy goal. The main policy approaches or strategies that are currently implemented to promote the electrification are related mainly to financial incentives or to improvements in the charging infrastructure. These strategies, however, they do neglect an important psychological barrier, which is range anxiety, the worry that a specific battery range may be insufficient to reach your destination. So we found that range anxiety is based on a highly specific cognitive bias, namely that people underestimate to what an extent an electric vehicle is compatible with their mobility needs. So when we asked people how many of their annual commutes they could complete with a given battery range without taking a charging stop, they estimated that it would be about half, about 50%. While in reality, it's much more, between 80 to 90 or sometimes even higher. And when we gave people the actual information about how many car trips they can complete without a charging stop, it reduced their range anxiety and increased their openness to adopting an EV. So you can actually use our knowledge on emotions to develop large-scale behavioral interventions that can promote concrete, more sustainable behaviors. So let me wrap this up. So far from being irrational influences, as they are sometimes misinterpreted, emotions do play a very central role in our judgment and our actions, and they may be important drivers to help a sustainable behavior change. We know now that the emotions that people feel towards climate change are very important predictors of their willingness to engage in mitigation and adaptation action, and also important predictors of their willingness to support climate policy. We also know now that activating emotions in communication strategies can be used to motivate people to take up climate action. And we find that reducing emotional barriers, such as the range anxiety, can motivate people to choose more sustainably. I just want to close by saying that applying these strategies at a large scale requires a solid evidence base. So you would need to base those interventions on what is known in the literature, adapted to the local context, especially when you're talking about emotions, and test the interventions before rolling them out on a large scale. And so with this, I'm at the end. So Eileen, back to you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Very interesting research. I just want to mention that Tobias published a paper on this research in collaboration with the SDG Lab. So Tobias, if you could share in the chat the link of the paper, that would be amazing for the audience. Yeah. For everyone, just make sure you engage in the chat with other people in the audience. And if you have a specific question for Tobias, please put it in the Q&A feature. So now I'm going to present our next participant, which is Harpreet Kaur, who will be talking about youth and responsive consumption in Asia. This is your turn, Harpreet.
Thanks, Eileen. And if you could also start sharing the screen, please. All right, we can go to the next screen. Thanks, Eileen. I'm Harpreet Kaur, the Business and Human Rights Specialist at the UNDP's Asia Pacific team, where I'm leading a regional project aimed at promoting responsible business practices through regional partnerships in Asia. And I think, the first slide is really sort of in terms of what we do, sort of in our work on business and human rights, we've really been able to, over the years, work closely with the governments, with the businesses in creating awareness and building capacities. So, in some ways we have been very successful in strengthening sort of the supply side of it. But what we haven't really been as successful in creating demand is from consumers and the communities. And I think that kind of, really was the driver behind why we wanted to conduct this piece of work. And it's more crucial also for us as we operate in Asia, where 60% of the world's youth live. Making actually up to about 1/5 of the region's population. So how they think, how they behave, act, or make decisions, I think could greatly influence how businesses operate, but also how governments regulate. So I think for us, we therefore wanted to understand their behavior, what, why, and how they're making these decisions during purchases. And so that, we can then use that as a leverage when we engage and advocate with the businesses. Aline, if you could go to the next slide. So what we did here is, we looked at sort of the 4 stages of the purchase journey. But given the lack of time today, I will focus only on 2 stages, sort of the first 2 stages right now. But also given my limited understanding and vocabulary of the behavioral science word, I think it's more about sharing our experience and our experience to use at our attempt to use behavioral science in our work. And we also have a technical partners, Behavioral Insights, Architecture and Strategy Private Limited online here, who are available to answer any technical questions that you may have as well. So what we looked at is, we've looked at these 4 stages, we've looked at the before, during, and after purchase, and we examined what kind of information is sought by the youth before they purchase, who's influencing these decisions or the decision-making progress, decision-making process, the parameters, the aspects, that they actually also considered while actual purchase as well, followed by the satisfaction level. And if they, after purchasing, how they liked, and if they are recommending or advocating for a certain product, and why, what were the trigger about advocating for these certain products. Next slide, please. So we gathered data in this way, where we reached out to about 5,000 people in the age group of 18 to 25 years through online panels, through colleges, universities, and the UNDP has a movers group, and we use sort of, different ways to kind of collect data in that sense. At the explicit level, we collected data through focus group discussions, trade-offs, but we also used implicit association tests. The quantitative sample was, kind of really collected through through across Asia, and I think largely from about 10 countries, a lot of respondents reported, but there were also sort of other countries Asian countries where some of the sample size is represented. And we looked at sort of 3 industries: fashion, cosmetics, and technology. And I can perhaps, share a message later in the chat on why we focused on these. But I think also because a lot of programming on business and human rights in Asia has been around these 3 sectors as well. So I think for us, it just really made sense because we were advocating and doing a lot of work with these 3 industries as well. Again, in the interest of the time, I will focus on the key data insights and findings, and the report will be published soon and will hopefully share with the network in the next few weeks as well. Next slide, please. So what does responsible consumption really means to the young consumers? And it was very interesting because, when we started looking at the responses and we started, understanding, analyzing the data, we realized that environment and climate related issues really dominated the narrative, and issues such as labor, human rights, can we go to the next slide? Issues such as labor and human rights were barely mentioned. And this was true for, almost for all the 3 categories that we studied, except for the technology related responses, where there were some mentions at least of the labor related issues. And I think this is also about, this could also be due to the saliency bias, or what I've been told is the invisibility spectrum, because it seems like, we see a lot of information about sustainability, about environment and climate change, and it kind of has become a brand. And it was very interesting because, this brand appears to be a green leaf, for example, but we don't really see the sweatshops every day, or we don't see the, the workers not being paid every day. So perhaps due to cognitive limited bandwidth, all that consumers were able to relate to or remember was about, issues around environment. I think the second thing, or the second finding from this, was also that the young people showed high involvement during the information seeking stage. However, this was primarily articulation anchored towards the producer's responsibilities while exonerating themselves. So it was also about, many felt that it's a responsibility of the companies, of the producers, on the manufacturers, and what we as an individual can do. And they said, these are the bigger problems. These are macro problems, therefore need macro solutions. And the thinking behind that was that the businesses have the power and the resources, and therefore held responsible for to take action. So I think that's in some ways you kind of sort of look at that. The responsibility was kind of pushed towards the producers as well. If you go to the next slide, please. And I think here's, in the next slide, we kind of also see the main finding as well, and the dichotomy that exists. Interestingly, when consumers, Ellen, you can, maybe click twice, you'll see all the slide in one way. But interestingly, when consumers were seeking information go back, please. Interestingly, when consumers were seeking information, the sum among all the other top parameters, at least aspects or parameters such as certifications, eco-friendly practices, fair labor practices appear to be considered. However, as they moved from that information seeking stage to actual time that they were actually buying, when these citizens, this aware citizen kind of landed in a store, whether physically or virtually, price, popularity, and discounts are the top ranked parameters. And the decline was, if you go to the next slide, we see that the decline is a pretty sharp between the numbers. So, we see in some ways that this consumer empathy gap. So there is an intent to purchase a sustainable product as a responsible citizen. However, the action told us a very different story. And I think that's where sort of the consumer mindset dominated. And Alan, if you could also sort of maybe click thrice. But what we see is I've picked up here, sort of 3 stark data points. And I think this is my second last slide. But, what we looked at is, and this is across three categories. And I've looked at sort of 3 parameters in terms of, they were considered roughly around 65 to 70% during the information seeking stage. But when it actually came down to sort of that action stage, that's where the variation ranged between only 2% to 4% of young people actually considered those factors. So what we saw in some ways, is kind of this big intent that we see, but when it comes to an actual action, I think, and I think that's where, that's where we kind of found also the intent action gap. The last slide in terms of how we're going to be able to sort of look at this data. I mean, and yeah, these are the 3 slides. If you could skip quickly, but I think this kind of shows how, these circles were representing how some of the elements were remained big, but the parameters around sustainability or responsible consumption were kind of really in those smaller circles. That shows that, during the purchase act of purchasing, what parameters are being discussed. How are we going to use this information in our programming? So the research is kind of in the final stages, and we're just kind of, some of these analysis is happening right now. But the way that we look at it now is, we're trying to identify it. Now we know sort of where the gap exists, but also we know the exact timing during the purchase journey, where we could sort of start looking at, what are the informational nudges that we can use to convert and change this intent to action. How can we support the decision or choice aids, but also how can we use other strategic communication, and therefore be bringing in those interventions that help us to move from this intent to action. I think the other part of it also, how do we create awareness and build capacity of consumers, and then use that as to leverage and kind of do our advocacy while working with businesses to respond behaviorally. So yeah, that's it. I think if you have any questions, be very happy to answer the later stage. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. Just to remind everyone, we are doing a Q&A section at the end when all the panelists have already presented. So please put your questions on the Q&A feature, and then we call them back. So now it will be my turn. I will be talking about a work that we have done led by the World Bank Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy. and the eMBeD team, the World Bank Behavioral Science team within the Poverty and Equity Global Practice, to support Lao government in their efforts to reduce open burning. So before we were talking about awareness and climate change, then Harpreet talked about purchase decisions, and now we're talking about the last end of the consumption stages. That would be, what do people do when they have already produced and generated waste and they need to manage it? The results from this project were collected in January and February of last year. So when we started this research, we had two hypotheses in mind. The first was that people lacked awareness on the dangers of burning waste. And the second was that most people lacked options to perform alternative behaviors. So we decided to develop an online survey to gather information on beliefs and attitudes, but also to test some messages and see whether we could influence the knowledge and intentions to change that behavior. This online survey was implemented in two different moments. A first section asked about beliefs and attitudes and showed the different messages that were randomly assigned to respondents. And then we asked respondents if they were willing to accept a second contact with them the next week to ask them whether they had performed or not some of these behaviors. On the baseline on the first week, we had around 3,000 surveys completed. And on the follow-up, the second week, we had around 1,920 respondents. So the online survey had some introductory questions that asked respondents on their attitudes and beliefs related to waste and waste burning. And then they were randomly assigned to one of these 6 groups. We had a control group that received no message, just ended the survey for the first week. We had treatment 1 that just gave them information on waste management and alternative behaviors, such as using the formal collection system, composting, recycling, or reusing. We had a second treatment that showed them an image of trash and communicated that burning is illegal, the prescriptive norm. Then we had a third treatment that showed them an image of someone having health issues, and the message said something like burning can affect your health. The fourth treatment made reference to how open burning could affect children, so it appealed to social responsibility. And the last treatment appealed to the monetary benefits of stopping burning waste. That first week, we asked them several questions related to attitudes, such as what would you recommend to someone that burned their wastes? Is burning bad for your health? Is it important to stop burning in Laos? And some intention questions. If they were willing to commit to stopping burning waste and starting performing alternative actions such as composting or recycling. And the second week, we came back to them and tried to ask them whether they had or not performed the actions they committed the week before. So a very important thing is that this was an online survey that was implemented through Facebook. So the sample was definitely somewhat biased. It was skewed towards young, educated people, but was still relevant for us to understand within that population what were some characteristics and attitudes towards waste burning. And the first insight we got was that using waste collection services strongly predict waste burning. So among those without waste collection, 53% burned their waste. while among those who did have waste collection, 78 didn't burn waste and only 22% burned waste. So access to waste collection does matter when they decide what to do with their waste. A second very interesting insight is that most people want to stop burning. Most people have some idea of the negative consequences of waste burning, but again, access might be one barrier, since while more than 8 out of 10 committed to stop burning, those without waste collection service burned more the second week when we asked them what they did. We see also a difference in the impact of the message for people who had or who didn't have access to waste collection. So for those who had waste collection, the messages increased the beliefs that stopping burning waste is important and that burning waste is bad for health. However, the messages weren't successful at changing their intentions. Finally, in terms of behaviors, we see a difference, a significant difference in comparison to the control group in the type of behaviors they performed for the last week. For example, they increased recycling and composting. For people without waste collection system, the message also increased the belief that burning is bad for health, and they also increase people's intentions to stop burning. So we see a difference in the commitment in respect to control groups. However, we didn't find any significant difference in changing waste burning behaviors. Finally, this is a very interesting, we tried to separate the different type of respondents into behavioral archetypes. So what were the different attitudes and behaviors they had towards waste management? And we found 5 different types of archetypes where we can see there are some positive deviants, a group of people that don't burn and they know that burning can be bad for behavior. We found another group of people that burned because they need access. They didn't have alternative opportunities to get rid of their waste. We found the people that were uninformed, that didn't know that burning was bad for their health or that it had negative consequences in general, so they just did it because they thought it was a good option. The money mindful, those who burn because they don't want to pay extra money in the formal collection, and the follow your neighbors, those who are highly influenced by their neighbors and social norms, thinking that open burning is a tradition and is part of the daily lives of everyone. And with these behavioral archetypes in mind, we outlined different types of intervention for the government to implement. So for the no burners, we recommended using them as what we call the positive deviants to showcase their behaviors to install a new social norm in the population. For the uninformed, we clearly have to focus on bringing better and accessible information about the negative consequences of open burning and what are the alternative behaviors. For those who need access, this is pretty much straightforward. We need to help them to access formal waste collections and have them be able to choose the different types of alternatives to open burning. The follow your neighbor can be influenced by the group of no burners. So these can help them understand that there will be a new social norm or that there is a new social norm in relation to how to manage waste. And the money mindful will need fees adjusted to their needs. So this was a diagnosis work. We hope that we can use these behavioral archetypes to develop an implementation. The project is still going on. And we just highlighted how communications should be tailored to different types of behavioral archetypes of personas. the importance of focusing on the cost benefits of not burning waste, and leveraging the positive social norms to encourage other forms of waste management. And of course, there are several structural barriers that need to be thought of before or at the same time that we think of nudging people's behavior that have to do with improving access, helping people manage organic waste, refining the fees model, and exploring social mechanisms and circular economy. So that was our work within eMBeD about open burning. And now it's a turn for Rachel Cosp, who will talk about applying behavioral science in scientific assessments. Rachel?
Thank you very much, Eileen. Let me share my screen. All right, thank you and greetings, everyone. I'm an associate program officer with the United Nations Environment Program working on scientific assessments. So I'm here today to present a case study of our application of behavioral science in UNEP's 7th edition of the Global Environment Outlook, or for short, GEO7. This work is intended to serve as a pilot for how behavioral science might be able to inform and be integrated into UNEP's other scientific assessments. So initially, I conducted a scoping exercise with getting advice from the United Nations Innovation Network, as well as reading key materials from the UN and otherwise on behavioral science to try to understand examples from other agencies, for example, the Global Environment Facility Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel and the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, to learn from their applications of behavioral science in ongoing work. And so then following that guidance and those good examples and key resources, our team initially decided to target the GEO7 to use as a pilot test, and then possibly be able to scale up any findings from this work. So from there, we held initial informational meetings with experts in the field to target potential partners for hosting a workshop to kick off the work and brainstorm potential applications of behavioral science specific to GEO7. So in this workshop, we hosted it in partnership with experts at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, as well as our team working on scientific assessments, and invited UNEP colleagues from the Law Division Communications, as well as the Chief Scientist's Office. The workshop included an expert dialogue to share insights on behavioral science relevant for GEO7, and it also produced plans to develop a guide for authors to write in a behaviorally informed manner, as well as to have a training session dedicated for the authors on behavioral science at the first GEO7 authors meeting. Additionally, some ideas to possibly implement later in the process include a visual journey for some of the key content, as well as segmentation of the audience to allow readers to input their information and/or specific questions to quickly find the most relevant information from the GEO7 content. In the workshop, the brainstorming sessions were broken down into 3 specific areas focused on either the authors, the audience, or the content, to try to understand in each of those 3 lenses of the scientific assessment process, how might behavioral science best support this the assessment process. So now at the first authors meeting, the training session on behavioral science was hosted by the Busara expert. And this is where the guide for authors was launched. Shown here on the slide is a visual summary of the information available for the authors, some of the key findings that they can use as they draft the scientific assessment. And additionally, experts were placed in the author teams throughout the week of discussions to support the experts and participate in the meetings so that the authors could understand how behavioral science might specifically be integrated across different chapters of the overall assessment. As a result from this first authors meeting, there are now dedicated parts of the assessment focused specifically on the topic, as well as the authors now have the resources to write using behavioral insights to appeal to the audience and communicate effectively. Now our team is exploring further options and different ideas to come up with ways throughout the rest of the scientific assessment process specific for GEO7 that behavioral science might inform the process. Some of these possible options include interactive chat and search functions, unique visual representations of the findings of GEO7, and using those unique visual representations to understand different ways to appeal to different audience members. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your talk. Very interesting. So now we are going to pass on to the Q&A section. I will start by reading two questions for Tobias, which are targeting the same kind of issue. So the first question is from Francis. He says, I've read that another broad anxiety is something like, there's no point, we are all doomed. Have you been able to study that at all? And then another question that is very similar says, there is, however, also evidence showing that eliciting negative emotions leads to helplessness, especially when sharing dystopian visions of the future is hindering individuals to take action. How do you make sure this does not happen?
Yeah, these are very interesting questions, of course, and they also do link into some of the more concrete work that we're actually doing in collaboration with the UN, especially with the SDG Lab in Geneva, where we try to communicate and identify research directions that are very interesting also for the UN as such. And a recent discussion was exactly about the question, well, how should we communicate about our progress in the SDGs, given that now we are more or less halfway? And should we emphasize that already good things are happening? So should we emphasize the positive, or should we emphasize that there is still a lot to do and that there are still a lot of problems and the outlook is fairly bleak? In terms of the negative impact of emotions, I would say that this is a question of degree. So I feel that a certain amount of negative emotions are useful in a way because it gives us the sign that there's really a problem happening. So if you're not at all afraid of climate change and the environmental situation, this mainly means that you haven't understood the problem, that you haven't understood how bad it is. Having a certain amount of anxiety or fear may be useful because it will actually activate you to go act on something, to mobilize your forces. However, too much, as the questions nicely reflect, too much is not good neither, because too much anxiety will immobilize us. So if it's really all about a helplessness narrative and about the question that we are all doomed, then of course this will immobilize people, this will paralyze them. One emotion that is being talked more and more in those recent days is climate anxiety, which exactly refers to this, that some people are so worried about the state of the climate that they basically stop functioning like a normal person, that they cannot find joy in their activities anymore, that they cannot enjoy being with their friends or their family, that they cannot work anymore. So there is indeed a too much of negativity that needs to be prevented and accounted for. So I don't know, I think this might actually link nicely with the next questions in the chat that I had already glimpsed at, where some questions turned around whether it is better to target negative emotions or to target positive emotions. So is it better to emphasize fear, anxiety, or should we talk about hope and optimism, a positive outlook? And again, this links with what I've said before. I think you need a certain amount of negativity indeed to see there is a problem. If you only communicate about advantages, if you only talk about optimism and hope, you risk that some people become complacent, that they say, well, if everything is so fine, I don't need to do anything. I can keep eating meat. I can keep using the planes every weekend. So you need a little bit of negativity to give people a jolt that there is a problem. However, another ingredient that you need, and that is the one that often comes with positive emotion, is the notion that you can actually do something, so that there is a certain potential to become active, that there's efficacy in the actions. So I would say, in answer to those questions, the best is to have like an emotional mix, in a way that you communicate, well, yes, the situation is dire and we need to act. But on the other hand, if we all act together in a concerted way, there is also indeed the hope that we can improve the situation.
Thank you very much, Tobias. So I will go, I will now ask a question to Harpreet. So the first question says, could you please mention the source of this purchase journey map? And then there's another question for Harpreet that tells, have you tested the impact of bringing worker rights issues to the forefront at the point of making purchase decision? We would love to know about what you found, if so.
Sure, thanks for those questions. And I think just, to begin with, the source of this purchase journey map. In fact, this is what I shared is kind of, really in some ways sort of the second step of our research. So as in the part of our first step, we actually did another survey in terms of, preparing for largely sort of couple of questions, but I think the three questions that we wanted to understand even before we started the actual research or the behavioral science experiments was which industries should we focus on, or sort of which categories should be focused on. But we also spoke to a number of young people to sort of understand, what and this purchase journey map is actually a result of those focus group discussions that we have conducted across different countries and different sample size as well. So I think this is kind of in some ways also a sort of an analysis of what we have looked at, what are the different stages that the young people were sharing in terms of their purchasing practices or sort of that journey as well. I don't know, Shubho and Madhu, I see both of you are online. If you do want to add any further clarification on that, that would be really helpful. I think the second question on the labor rights, in fact, when I did say that, when the young people are they're looking at mostly sort of, responsible consumption and, sort of looking at sustainability more in the context of environment. But also if we look at further data, sort of, when we looked further in depth in data, we realized, and because we did these specific deep dive studies, also in Bangladesh and India, it was very interesting where, in India, it was almost like 90% or more than 90% respondent actually said it's a sustainability kind of equals to environment. But when we started looking at the data that was coming from Bangladesh, in fact, in youth in Bangladesh showed a more diverse set of association, and these range from sustainability as indicating lasting a long time, sort of durability from the point of perspective of consumers, but also ethical actions, labor rights practices. And I think that's also largely part of because, in Bangladesh, you actually do hear a lot of stories about factory fires, and the factory fires, but also factory accidents that takes place. But also because it's a country that's dependent largely on sort of, it's an export-oriented country where you see a lot of garment factories, and therefore the issues around the workers' rights almost every day, in and around you, but you also see lots of workers going in and out of these factories. So I think, it was very interesting to sort of see that sort of a comparison between the two data sets that we were receiving from two different countries, but also sort of looking at, and then when we sort of started, I think also asking more questions about sort of workers' rights, and I think that it comes up But that really, I think at least, in a large part of our sample, that wasn't the case, except in Bangladesh, where, as I said, they do see sort of a lot more in their everyday lives as well.
Thank you, Harpreet. One last question. Here, Brandon says, for the research on responsible consumption, it sounds like respondents are pointing to a clear role for the state to devise and enforce regulations that get businesses. Have you explored this at all in your survey work? I also ask because, as a general matter, voluntary responsible consumption campaigns have not been very effective.
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's a very, very interesting field where, the businesses say the governments have the responsibility to regulate and, bring in those regulations where the responsibility primarily lies with the government, so that, they create that sort of an enabling environment where businesses have to operate, but also be compliant with the human rights issues. Government, on the other hand, have different, they kind of also, sort of in some ways identified other different stakeholders have a role to play. I think, if you look at the business and human rights space, actually the space is moving very fast from the voluntary to the mandatory, moving from a voluntary to a mandatory level, where, what started with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 10 years ago as a voluntary voluntary framework, which now is the global authoritative standard and framework on how businesses should respect human rights. But within these 10 years, we've also seen the governments coming up with a lot of legislation and moving towards mandatory human rights due diligence. So voluntary doesn't work in isolation. But I think what we need here is also a smart mix of voluntary and mandatory measures. And I think that's where, and therefore I said, what I said in the beginning is that we've managed to kind of, push the legal discourse. We've managed to push the businesses and the governments, but we haven't really been able to create and generate that demand from the consumers and the communities. And I think that's where, when you're looking at it, but you also see a lot of young people engaged in the climate action. And are we not leveraging that enough? And I think that's where, sort of we really wanted to understand. We really wanted to understand what is that we are missing in our work, and sort of, where we are not able to engage with consumers and bring in more young people into the conversation. So yeah, I think the answer really is that we do need a smart mix here. Now, sort of neither voluntary nor mandatory will work in its entirety, because we do have laws, but but we also see that don't work all the time. But there are also some voluntary measures which work much more than, even where we've seen mandatory and legislative provisions to work. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Now it's my turn to answer some questions. So the first question is, what was the criteria of creating 5 treatment groups? And how did these themes come into play? So for our research, what we've done is a qualitative and exploratory diagnosis first, which allowed us to understand or collect different themes that came out from interviews and focus group with people from Laos. From those interviews, we created hypotheses and got to develop these different themes that had to do with costs, had to do with social responsibility and health. And the idea was to test this quantitatively with the online survey. Another question is, what kind of waste management alternatives are more effective and should be adopted at national waste management policy? So in a few months, the eMBeD team with the environment and urban team from the World Bank is going to release and publish a compendium of different recommendations for waste management at national and municipal levels. But the truth is that this broadly depends on the capabilities of the government to process different types of waste. So specifically here in Laos, we found that people, mostly the composition of burnt waste was a 49% organic waste, 37% recyclable waste, and a mix of different other types of waste 14%. So what we see here is that clearly one of the biggest things that people burned and didn't know how to manage is organic waste. So probably composting sites are an important type of policy that could be implemented to avoid people continuing burning this type of waste. However, recyclables are also an important section of the burnt waste. So people don't know how to manage recyclables, and separate collection from these would also be an important initiative. But whatever type of behavior you are asking your population to do, it's important that from the other side, from the government side, you have a response that can actually collect and properly dispose the waste that people are separating, are sorting at the source. Another question was, how did you measure the behavior in the online survey of the messages? Well, this is definitely a limitation of surveys. We are asking for self-reported behaviors. So what we did was try to be as specific as possible, asking them what behaviors have they performed the last 5 days. So we have a clear boundary for them to remember what they have done, but we are always limited by the social desirability bias and how honest people respond to these surveys. And then the last question I'm going to answer has to do with no burners. Here, Brandon asked, are no burners really positive deviants if the only reason they don't burn is because they have education and resources that prevent them from burning? It seems instead the positive deviants are just people with privileges, and maybe the goal should be to focus on extending those resources and educations to the rest of the public. Definitely, Brandon, we agree with that. The biggest proportion of the no burners were people that had access to waste collection. However, what we found out, which is quite interesting, is that even in the countryside and places without access to formal waste collection, we found a group of no burners. So there are still people that don't have these privileges that are willing to perform alternative behaviors, which are composting, sorting, and trying to dispose correctly the rest of their waste. And for those people, the interesting thing is trying to reach them out and see what is the decision-making process that could help also, if socialized, help convince other people to start doing these alternative behaviors while we wait for them to get the access that they should. So that would be, just to respect time, I will allow now a moment for Rachel to come in, and I'm going to read for her some of the questions here. So Rachel, the first question is, what is it like applying behavioral science for the first time in an organization like the UN?
Thank you, Eileen. At first, it's not so difficult, not too challenging, because there is a good amount of guidance available between the UN Behavioral Sciences report and the Secretary General's guidance. However, then taking forward those guidance and applying it to the specific context and the problems that you're facing is where it becomes challenging. And fortunately, specifically in my team, we tend to work together and always brainstorm, and so we were able to find a way forward. But yeah, there's always challenges, and especially within the UN, of course, there's always administrative challenges. There's behavioral science. One of the sessions on that is tackling administrative burdens later today. So hopefully more and more this will become less of a problem, but that's also a challenge that we faced. But all in all, I would say there's a lot to learn, and then the hope is that we can document all the lessons that we've learned and then be able to provide those lessons for any projects going forward, specifically for scientific assessments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. We've reached the end of this session. I want to thank everyone in the audience for being there and asking the questions. And a special thanks to the panelists and the UN team for preparing the sessions for all this week. And please, everyone, just go ahead and join us for the rest of the sessions that we are having for this week of different types of issues and challenges that we are facing within behavioral science. Thank you very much to everyone. Bye-bye.